The importance of Edom for the fate of the southern Levant in antiquity is becoming increasingly clear in the recent years and has also been shown here on the conference already. Edom was a rather influential polity, and despite lying on the fringes of the southern Levant, both its copper mining activities, from which we heard yesterday in the early stages of its nomadic tribal organization, as well as the later Edomite trade in economic systems, proved rather impactful for the entire Levant. Yet, the idea of Edom being a marginal phenomenon is quite alive in biblical scholarship, which has, for some part at least, its roots in the biblical literatures itself. So the Hebrew Bible mentions Edom as a neighbor, occasional coalition partner, frequent enemy of Judah or Israel, on several occasions. And the text mentioning Edom, the Edom text, are scattered through various smaller biblical traditions. And additionally, the scholarly perception of Edom, from a biblical perspective at least, was limited for a long while now to a very constrained geographical area on the Edomite plateau and to the time of it, what was back then called monarchic period. So basically limited to the 8th to the 6th century BCE. In consequence, the impact of the seemingly short-lived and small Trans-Jordanian Iron Age kingdom of Edom was not regarded as impactful for both the Cisjordanian history and the biblical tradition. But in the meantime, however, the previous historical certainties have changed, especially the historical study of Edom has experienced an immense upswing in recent years, and our conference, of course, gives witness to this upswing. Against this background, in my paper, I will transfer this new understanding of the significance of Edom to the processes of the formation of the Hebrew Bible. And I will demonstrate that Edom plays a by far more crucial role within the biblical traditions than typically assumed. So due to time restrictions, I will limit my paper to the ongoing debate of Edom's role within the Jacob narrative, the Jacob cycle, and present to you my new observations and conclusions I made in my recent studies on this topic. The Jacob narrative is to be found in Genesis 25 to 35 and describes the rivalry between the twin brothers Jacob and Esau about the predominance among the two brothers. According to the well-known birth story, this rivalry between the two brothers already begins in the womb of their mother Rebekah, and thus determines their relationship from the very beginning, which ends up in Jacob stealing the firstborn blessing from his brother Esau. In terms of research history, two major insights of recent scholarship are very, very important here. The first one, the Jacob cycle is not just an episode within the larger Pentateuchal threads. It is better interpreted as an originally independent literary unit that had its own historical setting and tradition history. So only later was it then incorporated into larger narrative threads like the patriarchal narrative and the priestly writings. And this originally independent unit is not just one story among others, but seemingly a legend of Israel's origins. And the second point, the crucial element of the earliest and independent Jacob cycle is its political dimension. It has been successfully demonstrated by Albert de Pury or Erhard Bloom. So within the cycle, the figure of Jacob is constantly identified with Israel. His uncle Laban represents the Arameans, and Esau is associated with Seir and the Edomites. So it is evident that the Jacob cycle develops a national history through the frame of family history. So here Israel seeks to somehow position itself among the prominent surrounding nations, as to say Aram and Edom. Against this background, of course, the question arises, which historical background of Edom's relation with Israel is mirrored in the interactions of the twin brothers. And precisely this question constitutes still an unresolved problem in the reconstruction of the Jacob cycle formation. Theories and suggestions range from early pre-monarchic relations down to presumed Judean-Edomite conflicts in the 6th century in the Negev. One major reason for this very disparate debate, the Jacob narrative belongs to the oldest tradition material within the Hebrew Bible, and its literary growth is rather complex and spans from the earliest beginnings of the Pentateuchal tradition, that is probably the 9th or more likely the 8th century, and it reaches down through redactional reworkings to the Persian period, basically to the 4th century BCE. And this all, as you can tell, complicates the matters of political dimensions of the Jacob cycle. There's no need to go into detail here. It is sufficient here to just mention the complexity of this question. If one would only look at Israel, that is represented through the figure of Jacob, which in the original Jacob narrative only presents the northern kingdom, Israel. Later, of course, the Jacob cycle becomes part of the overall pan-Israelite patriarchal narrative, which concludes and leads to that the northern kingdom, but also Judah, is included in this imagination of Israel. So Jacob, in this version of a later version of the story, would also, of course, represent both entities, the north and the south. In what follows, I will focus on the question of the historical background, of course, of Edom in the Jacob cycle, and this means, well, on the oldest version, which probably stems from the 8th century. And I've outlined this already in a larger article, just to mention this. So the original version of the Jacob story from the 8th century ended with Genesis 33, the final encounter of Jacob with Esau, after having fled from Esau, after Jacob had stolen his blessing from his older brother in Genesis 27, and after 14 years abroad with his uncle Laban, Jacob finally dares to return and meet with his brother. In this concluding chapter are some surprising elements. I display here the verses 1 to 8. For instance, Jacob approaches his brother by bowing down 7 times, as you can read in verse 3, reminiscent of common court rituals when approaching a monarch, a king, as parallels, for example, from the Amarna letter indicate. This proskynesis fits the designation of Jacob as your servant in this text, and this episode and the corresponding my lord when Jacob approaches towards Esau. But I will show you a different sheet here from the beginning of the story. As you can see here, the play on Jacob's submission to Esau in this final and concluding scene as a monarchic figure seems to constitute a complete inversion of the blessing that Jacob stole from Esau in Genesis 27, where Jacob's dominion over Esau is emphasized. So I read Genesis 27. This is the blessing for Jacob. Peoples will serve you, to be avid. The nations will bow down to you. Be lord over your brother, and may your mother's son bow down to you. But in this final scene, it is, of course, Jacob that bows down to Esau. And ultimately, in this, if we come back to Genesis 33, Jacob offers, in the last part of this concluding scene, offers gifts, that is his wealth he gained over the past decades in order to appease his brother, who then accept. These are the small collection of verses I present here on this shield. The ending of this episode stresses that each people group, so the Israelites represented in Jacob and the Edomites represented in Esau, have their own territory without any needs for future rivalries. Esau will reside in Edom and in the mountains of Seir, verses 14 and 16, and Jacob in Sukkot, which is usually identified with De'er Allah in verse 17. This concludes the original narrative. Jacob settles in De'er Allah. So the fact that Esau receives his share from Jacob, from Israel's wealth in Genesis 33, indicates that both parties not only interact peacefully with each other, but also acted as partners on equal footing. And while most recent treatments of the Jacob story stress the element of conflict between Edom and Israel that seems to be reflected in this Jacob narrative, which might then, according to many scholars, reflect presumed border conflicts of Judah and Edom in the Negev from the, let's say, 6th or 7th century. I cannot stress enough the opposite point in the light of these observations here. The figure of Esau, and thus Edom, is placed in a remarkably positive position at the conclusion of the whole story. And these conclusions are critical for the historical analysis, which I will sketch out in the following minutes. First, the majority of recent scholarship is in agreement that the earliest version of the narrative should be dated into the reign of Jeroboam II in the 8th century. So basically the golden age of Israel under the successful northern king. Here the narrative would be then identified as origin myth of Israel. To my mind, this view should be modified. I generally agree with the northern origin of the Jacob tradition. Of course, Jacob is a northern figure. Yet I would contest the dating to the reign of Jeroboam. I propose instead a date shortly after the fall of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE. So one reason for this is that the king plays no role at all in the Jacob cycle, already possibly pointing to a post-722 situation. And another reason would be the heartland of the northern kingdom is not present in the original Jacob narrative. The episodes playing, which are situated in Shechem, Genesis 34, and at Bethel, are inserted only later to the narrative. The historical grounds for this situation is the situation after 722. The northern kingdom was split into 3 provinces, the province of Megiddo and the well-known province of Samarina, which essentially comprised the heartland of the former Israelite kingdom, including Bethel, Samaria, Shechem, which are again not present in this Jacob cycle. And the 3rd province, which is called the province of Gilead. And the toponyms of the finale, Genesis 32, Genesis 33, Penuel, Mahanaim, Jabbok, and Israel's final settling place, Sukkot, belonged to this province of Gilead, or rather to its immediate surroundings. So the Jordan may or may not have been a natural border between the Assyrian provinces, but it becomes clear from the topographical outset that the core land of Israel is empty in this story, and its ancestors figuratively settle only in its peripheries, like De'er Allah, Sukkot, towards the Transjordan regions, looking from this quote-unquote diaspora perspective upon the empty land. And second, one may conclude then that the Jacob cycle is best understood as what I would term with a very German term, Selbstgewisserungsliteratur of Israel. I translated it here for you on the sheet, self-affirmation literature. After losing its administrative and social economical structures, so the political, religious, and cultural institutions that had previously provided its cultural identity, the Jacob cycle depicts the new beginnings of an Israelite identity unified by its ancestor Jacob as a continuation, a memory of the Israelite kingdom of old. And the remarkable aspect I want to stress here and of this whole situation is that Edom, in the figure of Esau, is a crucial part of this memorization, actualization of Israel's identity. For the reasons why, one may point to the well-attested good political and economical relations between the Northern Kingdom and Edom during the 8th century. These connections have been reinforced by the much discussed findings from Untitled Chapter, but also by newest findings from Edomite archaeology indicating the presence of Northern Kingdom in the southern regions and pointing to the existence of multifaceted cultural contacts in the area between Israel and Edom. So the economic and political encounters, of course, come with cultural transfer. It appears to me that the tight relation of Edom and Israel reflects a deep acknowledgement of their common past during the monarchic period. Amongst these might be also a specific religious proximity. The well-known inscriptions from Kuntelet Ajrut mentioning the veneration of Adonai, Yahweh from Shomron, and Adonai from Teman, seemingly a place in Edom. And the remarkable biblical connection between the north and Edom is tangible in the Song of Deborah in Judges 5. The verses 4 to 5, which you can see here on the sheet, point to the origins of Adonai, Yahweh, in Seir and Edom, even though the deity was active in the north, which is where the origin of this tradition stems from. And in a broader perspective, this might be also a factor to explain the proximity between Edom's later national deity Kos and Yahweh, as it is attested in the Iron Age too, and particularly evident from the Persian and Hellenistic period's findings in Idumea. On this leads me to the corollary that the story of reconciliation between Jacob, Israel, and Esav, Edom, would not only reflect upon the friendly, tight, and enduring political and economic ties between Israel and Edom, but also acknowledge the common veneration of Yahweh, even if this might or may have been through different manifestations in Edom and the Northern Kingdom. So returning back now to my remarks from the beginning, I will emphasize from the perspective of Hebrew Bible scholarship that Edom is not an occasional marginal phenomenon within the literary memory of Israel, but rather the opposite. Edom plays a fabulous role within the history, this imagined history of Israel. And we should give more attention to Edom's crucial importance for Israel's self-imagination in future research. There's still more to discuss in this much debated field. And I just want to point in the last minute to one forthcoming publication. There's a forthcoming book about Edom and Idumea in the Persian period. And this Persian period is the research on Edom as biblical figure is nearly completely neglected and under-researched. And we try to do this research in this collection of essays in this book. And it's surprising how positive, even more positive than in the old tradition, how positive the existence of Edom is stressed in the later reductional layers that date even to the Persian period, when Judah, Israel, and Edom, the monarchic kingdoms, are long gone. So just to point you to this. But I will rest my case here and leave everything else to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.